In the year of our Lord 1173, Europe lay braided in rival claims and restless loyalties. Rivers and hilltops marked the boundaries of ambition, castles like teeth along the jaw of a continent. In that smoke-stained age, a man named Richard, son of Henry of Anjou, crowned in England, and son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of songs and schemes, rose like a promise and a threat at once. He was tall as rumor, fleet as a hound, and already awound in the pride of kings. The sun had not yet cleared the spires of Tours when word arrived: 3 of the king's sons had banded with French lords and Flemish barons. Henry the Young, Geoffrey, and John, children of royal quarrel and favor, had accepted alliances woven by their mother's restless mind. Eleanor of Aquitaine, brilliant and dangerous, had traded affection for influence and pressed her sons into rebellion. The castles of Normandy and Anjou, the breadbaskets of English power on the continent, became the chessboard upon which family and kingdom would be sacrificed. Richard returned from his own holdings in Aquitaine with the quiet confidence of a man who had already learned how to take what he wanted. His eyes held a patience that was not softness, his jaw, the stubborn curve of someone who had seen battle and survived. He found his mother taken by treachery on a road beset by royal men. He learned the words used against him: traitor, rebel, and let them fall like autumn leaves. When he rode into a castle blazing with the smoke of conquest and the bitter taste of betrayal, he found children watching from behind cracked shutters and women in coil of grief. Richard did not speak of diplomacy or honor, he spoke of survival and of iron. He spoke of the duty owed to a land and to a name, with a voice that asked neither permission nor praise. For in his chest burned a belief older than every crown: to seize an hour is to make it yours. Across the narrow channel, King Henry of England watched his realm like a man who had long memorized the exact circumference of fear. He knew his son's ambitions with the intimacy of a doctor who reads a pulse. This was no simple accusation, it was domestic war, and domestic wars tear at the stitches of kingdoms. Henry could call kings to his aid or barons to his banners. He could threaten, bribe, or bind. He preferred strategy, the cold arithmetic of men and castles. To him, the son's rebellion was a ledger to be balanced. In Paris, King Louis of France offered hospitality with a thin smile. He had the appetite of a neighbor who had watched another's orchard grow plump. He could not deny himself a bite. Louis met the rebel princes beneath tapestries and banners, giving them flattering names and terms. He promised help that came in the shape of soldiers and horses, the kind of help that asks for a price: land, homage, the quiet surrender of claims across a northern border. For Louis, this alliance tasted like leverage. For the princes, it tasted like risk dressed as hope. Soldiers came like rain from different courts: Scots who wanted to press their claims, Flemish men who wanted coin and spoils, barons from Brittany and Normandy who kept eyes on the horizon for whichever tide would lift their fortunes. Armies in that age were not simply muscle and steel, they were the sum of debts paid, promises made, and curses whispered at an inn. Men drew their swords for a cause as much as for coin. Richard walked among these men and watched how they ate and slept, how they prepared for the taking of stones. He saw fear where others saw only courage. He saw the small cruelties: rations cut, horses overworked, men given commands they could not follow, and he wondered what kind of victory asked its friends to become worse than the enemy they fought. He refused to be young and foolish. In him lived a thinking warrior who measured outcomes before deeds. One night, in the sudden hush before a massacre could start, Richard met a woman in a chapel who upheld a candle like an oath. She was named Marie. She was small and steady and said the obvious words with the uncommon tenderness of someone who had chosen a different kind of courage. She told him the chapel was filled with those who had nowhere else to go: women, children, old men. Richard's answer was not a sermon. It was action. He ordered restraint. He forbade the burning of the chapel and declared any who disobeyed would not only displease God but wake the wrath of his hate. For Richard believed that conquest that humbled the innocent was hollow, even victory stained by needless blood shrank under time's eye. Yet war has a way of stripping the lovely from the truth. Promises made in halls of silk were torn off like banners when the bell of battle rang. The son's rebellion swelled and sagged like a fever. Some castles opened gates at the sight of banner bands, others resisted to the last tile. The French king's willingness to assist was a poem that hid several stanzas of betrayal. The Scottish king, who had promised troops to trouble Henry, had his own condition: lands, expectations, compensation. Bargains were struck, and with every bargain the rebels dug a deeper hole. They could not imagine that their coalition was fragile because they were tied together by personal desire rather than public cause. Henry, the king, did not sit waiting for defeat. He moved through the night like a general and a parent. He gathered forces, sent for the loyalty of bishops and earls, and promised pardons to those who would return to his fold. A king who had built himself by law and discipline knew how to fracture a rebellion by the same means, divide ambition with mercy and bribe hunger with precedence. Henry's anger was a tempered blade. He could rage, more usefully he could bargain. Caught between their father's cunning and a patchwork of foreign allies, the princes began making mistakes. They argued as men do when the end is unlikely to be easy. They squabbled over spoils, over honor, over the shuttle of inheritance that always fell unevenly. Geoffrey, ever the politician, wanted caution. John, the youngest, was small, anxious, and jealous of favors he had not yet learned to win. Henry the Young, hot with his own claim, misread an open field for an outright advantage. In a world ruled by black and white heraldry, they were still composing gray. At the center of it all was Richard, who had learned to turn impatience into precision. When his men were stretched thin and provisions grew scarce, Richard did not despair. He shifted tactics as a poet shifts rhythm. He took what looked hopeless and turned it into the next cause of wonder. He surprised smaller garrisons, seized supply lines, and moved like wine through the broken fences of the enemy's plans. His men began to call him the Lion of Aquitaine. The name was not a cloak, it became an expectation. Treachery arrives easiest where camaraderie is least. A Templar, once companion, turned advocate, slipped from the enemy camp and spoke to Richard of a fortress at Rouen that could fall if handled right. Rouen was a jewel balanced on the Seine, and the man who took it could claim more than a wall of stone. He could claim commerce, authority, rumor. Richard accepted the counsel and moved as if to snare destiny itself. Inside Rouen, fear was a quiet animal. The city's captain saw banners at the horizon and calculated what he knew of the king's wrath. He suspected the men who approached were the vanguard of a larger, more dangerous force. He sent messengers. The castle's garrison readied pikes and boiled pitch. But Richard's force was an art of small numbers doing large work. He chose timing rather than testosterone. He sent envoys, then trickery, then sudden soldiery into the night. The gates hesitated, the defenders misread the rhythm and lost the door. When the banner of Richard appeared on the keep, the city felt as if a giant had risen from the earth to remold history. Henry heard this like thunder from afar. He did not love to show himself rash, but fatherhood, especially as a thing that had been betrayed, could twist caution into blinding need. He marched with banners that carried not only the weight of a kingdom but the personal anger of a man who thought his son's ingratitude as contempt. He wanted to break them and make them understand that a father's displeasure could remake their fate. There were sieges. There were the shouts that make the night resemble an animal fight. There were men whose names would never be sung, who died splintering ladders and holding breaths as stones fell. A kingdom is a sum of these anonymous sacrifices. Richard watched men die, and each death measured his resolve. When confronted with the man who had slain his close friend in a duel of pride, Richard learned to fold grief into purpose. He did not become harder, he became clearer. His mother, Eleanor, was not a passive figure in the unfolding tumult. She was imprisoned and moved like a chess piece through the hands of those who feared her. Henry had it upon his mind that a rebellious queen who could light the ambitions of her sons deserved a stern response. He kept her confined for years, a queen turned into an idea behind bars. Eleanor's capture became the wound that could not be healed by any treaty. It was a calculus of power that hardened the sons' resolve but also emptied them of the very instrument, her counsel, that had first driven them. As the year wore, divisions widened within the rebel camp. The alliances struck in halls of feasting did not weather the trenches. Men who had come for coin wanted coin. Men who had come for glory wanted glory. Richard, for all his bravery and cunning, realized that winning the war required more than vengeance, it required the loyalty of a realm. He began to speak not just as a conqueror but as a future lord who would be judged by how he tended both the spoils and the sorrow. One night before a decisive assault, Richard gathered captains and spoke to them plainly. He told them that a victory that devoured the people would be the kind that crumbled with the next winter's frost. He promised protection to churches and property to those who submitted. He offered justice to those who had suffered under misplaced authority. He fashioned himself as both iron and bomb. Men began to see in him a leader who could not be bought by a purse, nor swayed by flattery. They followed him for the steadiness of his gaze. The final engagements were a thrum of urgency and sorrow. Henry pushed from England with the methodical cruelty of law pressing into the chaos of rebellion. Skirmishes flared in the countryside like lightning, villages changed hands and then changed back. By then, Richard's reputation had outgrown him. The markers of his life, the speed of his cavalry, the sharpness of his mind, the rare mercy he sometimes showed, were stitched into songs. People said he had the eye that could read a man's true measure by the set of his mouth. They called him Lionheart, not as a mere boast but as an expectation of resolute courage. In the end, the rebellion failed to oust Henry's crown. Alliances fractured under the slow pressure of time and the quicker pressure of fear. Some princes were captured, some were pardoned, some lived to carry their defeat as a private shame. Richard withdrew from the immediate confrontation not as a broken son but as a man who had learned a new ledger: power without legitimacy is brittle. He would not again be content to be only his father's soldier. He would demand his own destiny. This story of men and crowns is not only the tale of lances and diplomacy. It is the tale of choices made in cold rooms and muddy fields, of a queen's ambition forged against a king's resolute law, of brothers who loved and betrayed and yet remained bound by the blood that flows through royal veins. Richard stepped from the furnace of this conflict tempered and resolute. He would later cross seas and face greater trials. The pages of history would record crusades, sieges, and ransom, but here, in these years of family and flame, he learned the grammar of kingship. In the days after the rebellion's collapse, Richard rode through the countryside with a quiet army. He inspected villages, restored a church where he could, negotiated the return of lands when the men asked for it. He was not making apologies, he was building foundations. He had seen what a people could endure when they were cared for rather than plundered. For a prince on a path to power, that lesson was more profitable than any coin. Henry kept the crown, but the shape of rule had been altered. He placed his family within the orbit of his authority and yet could not unmake what had been seen. The sons had tasted command, the lords had tasted fracture, the people had tasted the idea that kings could be challenged. In the years that followed, treaties were signed and broken, loyalties were remade, and Richard's name grew from rumor into legend. He grew from an impatient youth into a commander who knew when to strike and when to wait, when to be lion and when to be shepherd. History does not give simple moral endings. There were no perfect victors here, only men who learned to keep their hearts in check as they wielded power. Richard's legend, Lionheart, was forged in part by this crucible. He would later be known across Christendom for courage in faraway lands, for captures and ransoms that cost kingdoms, and for a stubborn sense of honor that both saved and doomed him at different times. But in the year 1173, when Europe churned with ambition, the man who would be lion proved one immutable truth: greatness is a thing that is both given and taken, nurtured by mercy and hammered by necessity. When silence settled at last over the fields, the survivors counted their losses. The names of the fallen were called in different tongues and remembered by a few. Castles stood like old teeth, roads remained worn by the passage of soldiers. And Richard, who had once come to a burning castle and found women and children behind broken shutters, rode on, no victor's trumpet in his ear, no final cheer. He had something older than triumph, the knowledge that the world was a place to be remade with both sword and oath. A few days later, as spring warmed the hedgerows and the rivers ran clearer, Richard walked into a church and laid his hand upon a simple book. He remembered the faces lit by a candle and the chapel that had once been threatened. He read the names of saints and sinners alike and vowed that his hand, when it touched the crown, would be steadier than his enemies expected. That vow would guide him through sieges and through ransom, through peace and through war. It would be the seed of a reign that wanted, at least sometimes, to be more than the echo of a father. Thus ends this telling of a year that changed a prince. It does not close the book. Richard's life was long and storied, but it marks the turning when a son became a man who would wrestle with his world not only by the edge of his blade but by the measure of his mind. History remembered him as Lionheart, his neighbors remembered him as an unpredictable force, the people would remember him differently still. In the end, the lion's heart is complex, fierce, tender to its chosen, and implacable to the traitorous. In that age of smoke and steel, Richard learned to keep his heart aflame and his purpose clear, and that would be the forge of legends to come.